Proud to introduce our next speaker. I'm excited because Fred and his wife Evelyn's story is fascinating. And I'll give you a tip. It involves buying a safe. Okay? So wait for that. Fred, make sure you bring in the safe. But I'm also really proud because I am personal friends with Fred and Evelyn since we were all at Pomona College together just a couple years ago. And it was interesting, this morning with Susanna, when we were talking about grit and perseverance, I just smiled because that is the essence of Fred and Evelyn. And I would dare say Fred especially was incredibly persistent when we were in college. They're also both journalists. And I think you can imagine about being a journalist and what it takes to be a great journalist really served them well in their journey. And that persistence and that investigation and that willingness to open yourself up and when you don't understand something and ask a ton of questions and to persevere. So with that, I'm going to introduce Fred Vogelstein to you, and his wife Evelyn is talking in his ear at the same time, I'm sure.
All right, hang on. See if I can't make this work, then I'll just think what I'm going to have to do is just hold this and be I think I need about a third hand. Thank you guys. It's a total delight to be here. I met Carol when she and I were 18 years old. So we've known each other for 5 or 6 years. It's really a pleasure. I'm here because 5 years ago, my wife Evelyn and I were desperate parents and we did something about it. And what we did not only helped us, it set in motion a treatment that's actually already helping hundreds of other kids. And by the end of next year, it likely will be available to millions of people worldwide. So I want to spend about 25 minutes talking you through that story. It's a slightly updated version of the story I wrote for Wired 2 years ago. It highlights some of the amazing things that good medicine, research, and health policy can do. And it also illustrates how broken our healthcare system is. So this is my son Sam a year ago. I like this picture because he's about to graduate from 8th grade. I like it because it captures exactly where he is right now, which is a happy, healthy, productive 16-year-old boy. 5 years ago, he didn't look anything like this. I'm not going to show you a picture because it's too upsetting. But trust me when I say he looked like a cancer patient. Not a bald cancer patient, but a horribly bloated and disfigured one. He didn't have cancer, he had epilepsy. But after 7 years of trying more than 24 medications, the only thing that Evelyn and I were able to find that would control his seizures was corticosteroid known as prednisone. Many of you here know what prednisone is. Those who don't, if you take it for a week, it can be a lifesaver. It's a synthetic version of the body's own anti-inflammatory compound, but you take it for an extended period and it wreaks havoc on the body. And 3 years ago, Sam had been on 80 milligrams of prednisone for nearly a year. It made him gain 30 pounds. It gave him moon face, which made his face look like it had been pumped up with air. And it weakened his immune system so much that he was starting to get head and chest colds every 2 weeks. Had he stayed on it, he faced stunted growth, diabetes, cataracts, high blood pressure, all before he was old enough to vote. So why did we subject him to this? Because Sam developed epilepsy when he was 4.5, and as he developed into a wonderful boy, his epilepsy got progressively worse. And so when they were uncontrolled, which was often, he could have between 10 and 20 episodes an hour. That's one every 3 to 6 minutes, and sometimes more than 100 a day. So we tried every possible drug, nearly 24 medications. Here's a list. And we tried non-standard therapies like the ketogenic diet. Little worked, and the treatments that did work generated horrible side effects. Sam doesn't have the kind of epilepsy you typically associate with seizures, where people fall to the ground and shake and lose consciousness. He has something known as absence seizures with a myoclonic component. It looks a little bit like this. It's a little bit like hitting the pause button on a DVD player. The seizures themselves are more benign than the big seizures that you have, but when you're losing consciousness every 3 to 5 minutes, your life is a mess. It's a little bit like trying to exist on the other end of a bad cell phone connection. So by 2011, we were desperate parents. There were no more drugs to try, no more creative therapies, except for one. In our scramble to find solutions, Evelyn learned that a nurse in one of our doctor's offices was starting a cannabis collective outside of work to help some of her doctor's sickest patients. Other parents we knew of epileptic kids were joining. Honestly, the whole thing sounded nuts to me. Yeah, I knew that you could use cannabis to treat all manner of illnesses, but in my head, smoking weed or cannabis of any kind was for partying, not for treating your kid's intractable chronic condition. It just seemed wrong. But we were desperate, and if you're desperate, you can't really be super doctrinaire. And the more we looked into cannabis, the more interested we became. As many of us now know, although we didn't really know this then, people have been smoking cannabis for thousands of years to treat ailments, and it turns out seizures are one of the most documented. And actually, we learned if you talk to any neurologist, they have a slew of patients who they know are smoking cannabis to control their seizures. And then, in a Google search, Evelyn tripped across this paper, a 2010 article in a publication called, appropriately, Seizure. It's actually the Journal of the British Epilepsy Association. It wasn't just the encouraging results that caught her eye, it was the authors. They were all researchers at the School of Pharmacy and Psychology at the University of Reading, which is one of the UK's top research institutions. She noted that they'd thanked a company called Pharmaceuticals for funding the study. We'd never heard of this company before. But we soon learned that GW manufactured pharmaceutical-grade extracts of both THC and CBD. Its main business came from a drug called Sativex, which is a mix of the compounds in a mouth spray for sufferers of cancer, pain, or multiple sclerosis. It wasn't available in the US, but it was available in dozens of countries outside the US, including the UK. What was particularly interesting was that it seemed to have supplied pure CBD to the authors of the seizure study. And so this was a light bulb moment for us. We thought, wait a second, there's a compound in cannabis that might control Sam's seizures, but wouldn't get him high. And there was a company in England that made it by the ton. And there was some evidence that CBD might actually be the compound in cannabis that controlled seizures. Give a mouse a rat, or a rat a seizure in a lab, and CBD seemed to stop it. And so through a family connection, we emailed this guy. His name is Geoffrey Guy. He's the chairman and founder of the company GW. And we actually truly said, you're sitting on a pile of stuff that we think might help our kid. Can you help us get some in the US? If you did that to a drug executive in the United States, he would run away from you very, very fast. But Geoffrey Guy didn't laugh at us and didn't run away from us. He actually helped us pull it off. British medicine works a little differently than it does in the US. Doctors there can actually put together individual clinical trials with their patients and drug companies without regulators getting involved. And this would be an experimental treatment of the first order. GW said it, in addition to rodent studies, it knew of about 100 people who had tried pure CBD for various ailments. It didn't know anybody that had tried it for epilepsy. So sure, cannabis was safe, but nobody had ever actually extracted one molecule out of the 500 there are in cannabis and given it to a kid. When you're the 100th person to try a compound on your kid, you might as well be the first. We didn't feel super good about it. On the other hand, we didn't really feel like we had a whole lot of choice. So now, you're probably wondering, who the heck goes from Berkeley, California to London, England for anything related to cannabis? The answer is remarkably, in 2012, if you wanted CBD in California, that's actually where you had to go. Sam wasn't going to be eating or smoking cannabis to treat himself. He was actually going to be trying one of the molecules, and actually separating the CBD from the rest of the cannabis plant is actually really, really hard to do. You actually have to know your way around a lab. We learned all this the hard way. We spent 6 months trying to source CBD, high CBD tinctures in the United States. Nothing we tried worked, except for a small amount that a friend of ours actually synthesized in her garage. You'll notice that the line I marked is the one done by our friend, but the rest of them are all so low in CBD that before you could actually get a therapeutic dose, you'd get very, very high. And so the only other place we knew to get high CBD tinctures was from a group known as the Stanley Brothers in Colorado. In 2012, they'd just begun experimenting with a preparation that came to be known as Charlotte's Web, but oddly, we didn't have access to any of that. There was a giant waiting list, and you had to live in California, and honestly, by that point, we were kind of fed up with the artisanal market for what we were looking for. One of the interesting things we discovered is, drug companies are not most of our favorite entities on the planet, but it turns out they're actually pretty good at doing one thing, which is making each pill exactly the same and making sure that it doesn't really matter whether or not which pharmacy you go to and what day you go to it on. when you're trying to treat your kid's illness that way, it's really, really, really difficult. One of the variables that we just assume when we treat whatever issue we've got or one of our loved ones has is that the medicine that we're actually using is exactly what is said to be on the bottle, does what we expect it to do, and that it doesn't really matter whether or not we get it here or in Portland or in San Francisco or anywhere in the country. Every pill is going to be the same. What we found was when we were trying to treat Sam with cannabis in California was that it depended on the hour and the day of the week and who you were talking to in terms of what you actually got. Oddly, London was the center of all this, of the pharmaceutical cannabis business. How did I turn this off? Hang on. London was the center of the pharmaceutical cannabis business because of something that happened in the 90s. The courts were actually clogged with cases of MS and cancer patients who'd been arrested for using cannabis to control their symptoms. But the problem was most got off, and so this was making a mockery of the legal system in the UK. And they decided, in their wisdom, and we haven't done this yet, the DEA in the UK essentially said, well, the only way to figure out whether or not this stuff actually works is to actually have a drug company be in charge of its development. And Geoffrey got the license to grow legal cannabis and develop drugs from it for MS and cancer pain and other kinds of things in the late 1990s. So from our perspective, actually going to London to try CBD for Sam was actually really the only option. So I'm still astonished, actually, when I tell people how fast the pills worked for Sam. He had 68 seizures the day we arrived in London, and within half a week, he was down to less than 10. And by the time he and Evelyn left London 2 weeks later, he was having less than 5 seizures a day. I think that's a 95% reduction. It didn't immediately cure him, but it gave him his life back. And it gave him his life back for the first time since preschool. After a decade struggling to keep Sam's seizures to 5 an hour, the new normal suddenly was 5 to 10 seizures a day. It wasn't good enough to let him ride a bike, and he probably wouldn't be able to drive, but I wasn't sure before we went to London whether or not he would ever be well enough to live on his own. And it was instantly clear to me that that was no longer going to be an issue at all. You know, he was taking the bus and train home from school every day. He was doing more sports than he had time to do. You know, he went to sleepaway camp for 2 weeks for the first time. And then life threw us another curve. Shortly after the Wired story appeared in the fall of 2015, Sam had his first tonic-clonic seizure. For the rest of you, that's a big, hairy, fall on the ground, shake violently, froth at the mouth, grand mal seizure. Our neurologist said, do nothing, you'll probably never have another one. But he had another one 3 weeks later, and another one 3 weeks after that, and another one 3 weeks after that. We were a mess. We actually thought we were back at square one. We increased the dose of Epidiolex that he was on, and it didn't seem to work. And it was controlling the little seizures, it just wasn't controlling the big ones that he suddenly seemed to develop. Our doctor, who is fabulous, Roberta Chilio, she bravely backed our whole journey to help him in all of this. She said, you know, we probably have to put him on another med, and said, okay, we should try this drug called Depakote, which is a standard epilepsy drug. It's like one of the first things you give a kid when they have seizures. And she, you know, gave me the line about it being well tolerated, et cetera, et cetera. And then she said something even more astonishing. She said, you know, it might work synergistically with the Epidiolex, meaning that it might actually make the little seizures go away and the big ones too. And I remember thinking to myself, yeah, and I've got some beachfront property in Arizona to sell you. Except she turned out to be right. So the combination of these two drugs has gotten Sam completely seizure-free. Actually, today it's been 18 months. He hasn't had a seizure since December 14th, 2015. He had a bar mitzvah last year. In February, he entered his first fencing tournament. He's going backpacking in Wyoming this summer. His friend Ian is pestering him to ride a bike. In 6 months, when he's been seizure-free for 2 years, he can get a driver's license. What's really amazing about our journey is not just our story, it's that Sam became patient number 1 for GW's epilepsy drug, Epidiolex. It's now in phase 3 trials. Within a month of our return from London in early 2013, Guy and GW started talking to Epidiolex, started talking to blah, 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 epileptologists at 4 other US hospitals about doing studies with their sickest kids. That led to more tests and more trials, and we've gotten to the point now where there are more than 1,500 kids at 4 dozen hospitals who are now trying this medicine. It's already reported success in 3 placebo-controlled trials. It has a fast-track designation from the FDA, which means that it's on track to be available at Walgreens by the end of next year. 2 weeks ago, they even published a piece about the research in the New England Journal of Medicine. You know, so what's amazing about this is that doctors actually say this could be one of the most exciting new seizure drugs in a generation. Most of you probably don't know this, but a lot of people think seizures and epilepsy is like an orphan disease, but it affects actually 1% of us. And what's even more astonishing is that about 1/3 of the people who are diagnosed with epilepsy don't respond to medications. So that means there are about 1 million people, almost half of them kids, with epilepsy in the US who aren't adequately controlled by the existing medications out there. This drug seems to actually work when other drugs do not. In fact, you can't get into the trials for this drug unless you've tried a handful of other drugs that haven't worked. So this actually has the possibility of shrinking the number of people who are not treatable for the first time in 2 generations. So that's the good news. The bad news is that how is it that we live in a country that required us to spend so much time and money to do this at all? You know, had we lived in the UK, where cannabis derivatives exist as legal medicines, we, together with our neurologist and her hospital, could have called GW and set up an individual clinical trial with little regulatory involvement. It might have even been covered by insurance. But that's not allowed here. Instead, we spent more than $100,000 on travel and doctors, and most of all, on consultants to help us prepare documents that would pass muster with the FDA and DEA. So it's awesome that GW had all that CBD and that Sam responded to it, but as a public company, it wasn't about to let us take any of the CBD that had helped him back to the US. I mean, we thought maybe they'll let us take a few bottles back in our suitcase, and they actually sent executives to our hotel to pick it up. They weren't messing around. They gave us enough to treat him on the flight back, and that was it. It was up to us to figure out a way to get the FDA and the DEA to approve our application to import this drug into the United States. As you can tell, our FDA submission was 468 pages long. It gets even weirder. Before the DEA would approve our application, they said we had to buy a safe to store the drugs in. And that's actually the safe I bought. Turns out they're used safes that you can buy. Who knew? And of course, like I remember when this all happened, I thought, oh, okay, I'll just go to Home Depot and get a jewelry safe. That's fine. It's no big deal. And that wasn't the safe that they were thinking about. Like they were thinking about a safe that Roadrunner used to drop on Coyote. Actually, or am I getting it mixed up? I think it was Coyote used to try to drop it on Roadrunner. Every new hospital that entered GW's trial had to get one of these or something like it. You know, we wouldn't have had to do this for a box of fentanyl patches or a garbage bag of Vicodin pills. But for a pharmaceutical derivative of cannabis that wouldn't get anybody high, yep, that's what the rule said. And you know, there's actually a reason why this safe weighs so much. The regulations actually say that if it weighed more than 750 pounds, if it weighed less than 750 pounds, you had to bolt it to the floor. So my doctor and I knew that we could probably figure out a way to get this safe into her office without really calling facilities. We figured that if we got a safe that had to be bolted to the floor, that would cause all kinds of issues. So why are we doing this to ourselves? You know, obviously we need to figure out a way to legalize cannabis for all of us. Oddly, we've done that here in Washington and in 7 or 8 other states, but we're still in a very strange world regarding that. It's as easy to buy cannabis in Washington or Oregon or now California as it is to buy a bottle of scotch. But if you're a scientist at any of the major universities in any of those states, you still have to do things the old-fashioned way. You have to get approval from the federal government. And so you can't actually, if you're a doctor trying to study cannabis in any of those states, you can't actually go and buy it and study it yourself. You'll wind up losing your license. All of these places are subject to federal law. And so it's weird. We can't, it's just, we can go buy cannabis as easy as buying a bottle of scotch, but we can't actually yet study it. So we need to fix that. And we need to reduce the paperwork and the cost necessary to do what we did. The FDA said that last year, that they've taken all the issue, that they've taken the time that it took us to put together our application and boiled it down to a small form that anybody can fill out in 45 minutes. I'm waiting to see if that turns out to be true. But there are actually simpler things that we can do right now. So I want to go through some of them. Because I think if all of us here have talked a little bit about how all of us are here in one way or another because we know people who are in healthcare pickles or feel strongly that we want to try to fix that for other people. But I think many of us aren't sure exactly how to start when we have one of those problems dumped on us. And so I'm going to throw out a couple of ideas. Some of this is obvious, some of it may not be. The first one is get the agenda for the annual doctors conference for your disease. Every disease has an annual meeting of sorts. Some of them are bigger than others. I think the cancer meeting in Chicago a couple of weeks ago takes over the entire city. It's like hundreds of thousands of people. But epilepsy has one, and Evelyn's gone. If you can afford it, go to the conference. You'll meet all kinds of interesting people and doctors, and you'll learn something just by osmosis. The other is reach out to your disease nonprofit. Almost every disease has one, and many have 2 or 3. Find the one that's focused most on research and get plugged into that. Go to one of their fundraising dinners if you can. And then the last one is, and I think this is probably the most critical, become a PubMed search ninja. We all know how to search Google and Facebook groups, so just apply the same skills to the government database of peer-reviewed scientific research. It exists, and a lot of it will be hard to read because it's scientific language, but what you'll discover is you'll start to, simply by marinating in all of that research, you'll start to figure out who publishes the most about the particular issue that you have. And you may not be able to go see them, but you'll certainly learn a little bit about what the cutting edge trends and thinking are in that research. One of the reasons you try to go to, I realize that one of the reasons that people like to go to top doctors is beyond the obvious, which is like you want to go to somebody who you feel like knows what they're doing. Especially in a disease like epilepsy, which can be really, really hard to treat, you want to try to go to a top doctor who publishes a lot because in many ways, their whole practice is a trial and error. It's trial and error with notes. The more patients you treat with tough seizure conditions, the more data you have, the more data you can pass along to your patients. One of the things that I think that helped us the most, and I found myself wondering while I was here whether or not there was a way to actually make this happen. A friend of mine who's a doctor let me use his PubMed logon, which meant that we were able to not only search PubMed for abstracts, but we were also able to actually download and read the actual articles themselves. And I found myself thinking, what if insurance companies or doctors or whoever enabled patients to easily get access to similar logins, that if you wanted to, and you said to your doctor, I need to actually learn more about this, can you give me a PubMed logon so that I could read all the research, that they would have a couple to be able to lend to you for a period of time. The ultimate goal in all this, obviously, is just to kind of help you find new experts to reach out to and new questions to ask. We learned that epilepsy is much an art as it is a science, and there are many different approaches about how to treat complicated seizure disorders. So, we're overjoyed about where we are and where Sam is. He's well. We jump-started the development of a new drug that's going to help lots and lots of other people. But the system we have is messed up, and it needs to be tweaked and fixed and addressed in a way that it isn't being addressed now. And I think that one of the reasons I think this conference is so fabulous is that this is the first step in trying to get there. So thank you all very much. So I'll answer any questions you have. Don't be shy.
Thank you very much, Fred, for sharing your story. And I just wanted to ask, because I'm more familiar with the FDA processes than the DEA processes. And I want to ask, from the beginning of you being exposed to the DEA till now, are you seeing any interagency communication? Is any change being affected as more and more of this research is being done? It seems like some of these draconian rules, you would at least see some initial progress.
I think there's been some. So the question is, what's going on at the DEA, and whether or not the DEA and the FDA are actually working together more to make this process work faster. I think the answer is yes. So when we did it, they looked at us as if we were high. I mean, I can't really go into the kind of I wrote letters, and it required people with some contacts in the DEA that I knew to have conversations on park benches to get this process rolling. I think now that you've got 4 hospitals, all with some of the top epileptologists in the US working on this, that there's actually a pathway to get this working through the DEA, and there's some cooperation that's going on between the FDA and the DEA. But the DEA is a police organization, and it's part of the Department of Justice, and the Department of Justice is headed by Jeff Sessions. So it's hard to know how that's going to evolve going forward. I'd like to think that because the FDA is a scientific organization, that it's going to be difficult for the DEA to push back, but I've come to believe that anything is possible now. Go ahead.
I don't know if Mike will just shout, but I'd love the tips, kind of the practical advice. If you could go back, if you had to go back, God forbid, and do this again, how would you approach this differently, if at all?
That's a really great question. The question is, what would we do differently if we had to go back and do this again? I wouldn't do this. I would have figured out a way to get plugged into oddly, I would have figured out a way to get plugged into the artisanal market in Colorado. One of the things that, we didn't have any particular interest in getting a drug company involved in what we were doing or in going to the UK to do it. What we realized in 2012 was that it didn't seem like there was any alternative. I knew about what was going on in Colorado, but it was nascent, and there was really not that much evidence that it would become a reliable source of medicine for so many kids. If I had known that it was going to be, that it would turn into that, I would have obviously tried to do that instead of what we did. So I hope that answers your question. Nobody else.
So I have an experience that's somewhat similar, but not on the illegal side in the U.S. But so I'm interested to know what your experience is, or if you can share a little bit about how this impacted your life at the time. I think you said your son was in preschool when it started, and then now he's sounds like high school age-ish. But how this impacted your family life, your other children, because I think there's the touchy, I'll call it the touchy-feely side, that people don't understand what people in this situation are going through, because you tackled it, you tackled everything head on, you did what you had to do, you did it for your kids, right? Your son here. And there's a whole lot of other family dynamics and other things that go on with your jobs, your wife and her responsibilities, her job, other children, and your social life. I mean, how did it impact all of those types of things?
It blew it up.
Exactly.
Thank you for asking that question.
Yeah, it's very important for people to understand that while these things are happening, that everything else goes by the wayside because you are forced to tackle this. You have no other time to do anything else, and when you have work, you do what you have to do at work, and then this is what you're doing the rest of the time. And it's really I think people need to understand that. I have another simple question for you. Did you ever consider moving to the UK?
Absolutely. Initially I considered moving to Colorado, and then once we started the process in the UK, absolutely. I knew that, especially once we discovered that it actually worked, I think it was, we tried really hard to try to get it into the US, not just for us, but hoping that it would actually lead somewhere for other kids. But if we'd been shut down, I think we would have had absolutely no choice but to do something like that. But going back to your first question, I think that it's actually hard to put into words the kind of impact that 10 years of dealing with constant seizures does to your family. I sometimes like to think of, at least the way I dealt with it, was that I thought of myself as a ox pulling a cart across a very, very long field. So the only way to actually make that work is to look at your feet. So, in addition to all the other things that are obvious that it impacted, it changes your whole outlook on life if you're constantly looking at your feet, because every time you stick your head up, you look at how big the field is and you want to sit in the dirt and weep. It changes your outlook. But it also changed the way Evelyn and I interacted, right? So one of the things we discovered was that every time we sat down to try to have a conversation about Sam's medication, did we need to tweak it? And these were monthly conversations because managing Sam's seizures was, whatever we came up with seemed to last a couple of weeks, and then we'd have to have some kind of other medication conversation. One of the things we discovered was that we actually couldn't get through those conversations in a one-on-one basis. So we just decided to send each other emails. It sounds incredibly it sounds incredibly weird and antiseptic for how a husband and wife would communicate about something like this, except what we discovered was that the issues that we were talking about were so difficult and so emotional that it was actually better for each of us to get an email, look at it, scream into a bag that we were dealing with this, and then think carefully about what made sense and what didn't make sense, because we couldn't actually get 2 sentences into a conversation before one of us would cut the other one off and go, I just don't understand why you're bringing this up now. So yeah, it's a disaster and one of the reasons I wrote about it, and one of the reasons I actually feel so strongly about the issues that we're talking about here is, Evelyn and I talked about how hard it was for us and shook our head a lot, thinking if both of us if both of us hadn't finished high school and we both had hourly jobs that had zero flexibility, we wouldn't have stood a chance. And that's unfair. We need to do something to fix that because that creates a bifurcation in our society that takes us to a very, very bad place.
Is the medication he's taking sustainable? Do you worry that it has side effects or that it will lose efficacy after some time?
No, but that's only because I've seen that happen so many times already that I know that it's just not worth it to my psyche. I mean, if I told you the number of times that we tried a medication that worked but had horrible side effects, but then tried that medication at another time and it did absolutely nothing at all, or medications that just stopped working for no reason whatsoever. I mean, this was sort of our daily existence. They've worked, so the 2 medicines that he's on have been working and gotten him seizure-free for 1.5 years. I'll take that. I don't know what the future brings, but I'm hopeful.
And no side effects?
No. I mean, there's some stomach upset that he takes a stomach pill for. And one of the things that we discovered about the Epidiolex is that if you are on too high a dose, it starts to make you puke. It's kind of odd, right? I mean, most people think about cannabis as giving them the munchies. But it turns out actually that there's a molecule in the cannabis plant that if you take too much, it actually makes you vomit. but this is part of the process of actually being on an experimental medicine, which is nobody actually knows what the right dose is. But so far, we have not observed any long-term side effects. But the short answer is, we don't know, But the alternative is not so good.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Two questions ago, you touched on the chasm between those who have the time and wherewithal to really pursue solutions versus those who don't. And I'm wondering, with the advent of genetic solutions, whether the folks who have the wherewithal to push for this kind of broad-based solution may turn their attention to, and their finances and whatnot, to CRISPR, which would be a very targeted type of solution and potentially require a higher cost of care than, a pill that gets generalized. Do you have any thoughts about that?
I don't have any thoughts about the cost. What I do know is that one of the things that is actually getting a lot of traction right now in at least the epilepsy community is trying to associate certain seizure types with that they present visually with certain genetic predispositions, and then to associate those genetic predispositions to specific drugs or other kinds of therapies. Because oddly, people have had epilepsy since there were people, but it's astonishing how much guesswork is involved in treating at least this disease, right? So one of the things that was all of us here, I think, understand, but a lot of us who aren't here don't understand, I think, is when you wind up getting involved in a disease that is chronic and hard to treat, you find yourself coming face to face with doctors who say things like, I don't know, let's try it, or maybe not. Which aren't really satisfying answers when you are trying to deal with this sort of stuff. But so in epilepsy, one of the things that they're actually trying to do is they're trying to actually associate all that so that when somebody shows up with a certain kind of seizure, they can do a blood test and say, oh, you have this genetic profile and these kinds of seizures, this drug works best. As for CRISPR, that sounds awesome and scary, right? The idea that you could say, you have epilepsy and it's untreatable, so what we're gonna do is reboot your genes so that you no longer have seizures. That's awesome. I wouldn't want to be the first.
Yeah, and kind of what worries me about that scenario is it becomes a magic pill for people who have enormous amounts of money to spend on it, and the will to pursue solutions such as the one you found may evaporate. The will or the wherewithal to pursue those.
I'm always on the fence. I'm always on the fence about that. On one hand, I believe that our system is messed up and totally unfair. On the other hand, I'm also pro-innovation, pro-technology, because ultimately, the more we know, the better off we are. And a drug that initially might cost more than most people could afford, would historically, the prices of those drugs falls to a point where they are affordable, either because they go off patent, but also because of public pressure to drive the price down and make them more affordable. But it's better to sort of be in a situation like that where we can use sort of public pressure to control drug prices than to say we shouldn't actually find out about this or develop this at all.
If it's okay, you're going to be around.
Yeah.
So let's give me 1 second. Let's break, and then you guys can follow up with Fred in a minute, if that's okay.
You want to do, or do you want to do one more question in the back? I'm going to overrule you.
There's no pressure. Go ahead.
Well, I know I'm really on the spot. I have to make this a really important question. Clearly your son lived, most of his life with, uncontrollable seizures from before when he can remember till recently. And you talked about the changes in his quality of life, but are you willing to share kind of what does he say about the experience, about his life and how it's changed in the whole process of the trial, the clinical trial that you worked with him on?
So the question is, how does Sam feel about all this? I wish I could say that right now he's in a really, really good place. I think he sometimes worries that the seizures will come back, even though they've been gone a year and a half. But he's in a pretty good place emotionally about all of that. Oddly, when we first got them under control after we came back from London, he was not in a good place at all, because he'd spent most of the previous 7 or 8 years in a total fog. And all of a sudden, he was much more present. And so it was actually interesting. We thought that he would be overjoyed that he wouldn't be seizing as much, but it actually turned out that the 5 seizures he was having a day actually bothered him and almost really kind of traumatized him a little bit, because he was so aware of what his life was without them. He actually noticed them a lot more. But it's interesting. He's just getting to the point where he can articulate some of how he felt about stuff right in the middle of it. So I'll keep you posted.